get started. If you could make your way to your seat if you aren't there yet. Grab a little food, a drink if you need. Excuse me. All right, so I'm going to get things started. I have 5 introductions. 4 of them are fast, one's a little longer, but I think you'll see the logic of that last one when I get to it, and then I'll hand things over to Dr. Kim and Dr. Mobrand. So, first, my name is Dr. Jacob Shively. I am Associate Dean for the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities. Our Dean, Dr. David Earle, couldn't make it this evening, but he does very much enjoy this event and the discussions that come from it. He also really enjoys the food that people get afterwards, so and the food that we've had here. So CASH is actually my second introduction. I just want to briefly say that we host 9 academic departments and several other units. These range from theater to archaeology to politics, but this is really a Department of Government event. And I am a professor also in the Department of Government. I teach international relations and foreign policy if you're curious, but that's not why we're here. The Department of Government is my next introduction. The Government Department has several majors, international studies, pre-law, and political science, in addition to languages, Spanish, French, Italian, and Japanese. Now, I also want to briefly mention Dr. Elvis Kim. That's my 4th introduction. He's our Askew Fellow this year. Each year we have an Askew Fellow who focuses on their research, and we have a student scholar as well. Dr. Kim has invited a scholar that he admires his work, and he'll tell you a little bit more about that. So this is an annual event, the Askew Lecture, for those who haven't come. I'll talk a little bit about where this comes from, actually, in a moment. Now, I do want to brag on Dr. Kim a little bit. He's been here a couple years now in our department, and one thing we like to do in government and across UWF and the college is be a teacher scholar. Now, what do we mean by that? Normally, academics love doing research, and we also spend a lot of time in the classroom. And some universities focus more on research, others on teaching. At UWF, it's a little bit of both, which means you're bringing your scholarship into the classroom, you're engaging students in research. And Dr. Kim really displayed those qualities when he came and interviewed. We put professors through this ridiculous process where they have to go spend 2 days going around. I don't recommend it. But at the end of it, it's a pretty nice job. But Dr. Kim came in, he has fascinating research that he was conducting at Boston University. And also, crucially, when he showed up, he was super prepared for this classroom. He had questions for students, a kind of follow-up, a little bit of an exam discussion. So it was a fascinating class, and he had fascinating research, and it really exemplified what we do here in the Department of Government. Now, I wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about my last introduction, and that is Reuben O.D. Askew himself. You'll notice this is the Askew Lecture, and the department is the Askew Department of Government. Where does that come from? What are we talking about here? So Reuben Askew was the governor of Florida, in case you didn't know, between 1971 and 1979. About a decade ago, a legendary figure in Pensacola history, Fred Levin, donated several gifts to the university, and one of those involved the Department of Government. And his request was, please name your department after Reuben O.D. Askew. Now, Fred Levin was a man with a very large ego. I think even he would admit that. He was that kind of flamboyant guy. But he wanted to recognize someone who had worked with his father in his law firm, Reuben Askew, who had gone on to be governor. Now, this was interesting because Askew was a very different type of personality. In his campaign, when he was running in 1970, his opponent laughed at him and said he's a little too clean-cut. Claude Kirk said, the incumbent, a mama's boy and a nice, sweet-looking fellow, but clearly not, cut out to be governor of Florida. Reuben leaned into the insult, and in contrast to Claude the Clown, as they started to call him, Reuben the Good became the watchword. So Reuben the Good became Florida governor. He won handily, and I will say Reuben seemed to draw on his background. He had grown up relatively poor with a single mother and 5 siblings. But he was hardworking and ambitious, and interestingly, he was, in a way, a two-time veteran. He served in the 82nd Airborne in the late 1940s, and then later in the Korean War as an Air Force intelligence officer. But his key career move was to go to law school at FSU and become a lawyer here in town with David Levin, Fred Levin's father. So they formed the law firm Levin and Askew, which now today is the Levin Papantonio law firm, which is just a nationally recognized law firm just a couple blocks from here. Askew himself had worked his way up the political ladder from assistant county solicitor in Escambia County all the way up to Senate pro tempore in the Florida Senate before he became governor. This was in the civil rights era. He first took office in the 50s and was serving through the 60s. And interestingly, Reuben Askew was a kind of personally conservative guy, but he was a reformer. He was very interested in changing the distribution of votes in Florida, make sure they were fair, representing rural and urban areas equally. He was strongly against segregation and supported the 1965 Civil Rights Act. And as a gubernatorial candidate, he promised to upend many of the Old South policies and practices that had really kept the region from succeeding, he thought, the way it could, economically and politically. So when he took office, he joined a wave of New South governors, as they were called, in 1970 and 71. This was Dale Bumpers of Arkansas, John C. West of South Carolina, and most famously Jimmy Carter of Georgia. These leaders upended their state civil rights laws, education policy. Well, I don't want to say upended, they updated their civil rights laws, education, environmental policies, economic approaches, and implemented transparency policies and standards. So rather than revolutionaries, these politicians really looked at themselves as someone who would work across the aisle, be pragmatic, but also make a positive change. So one of my favorites, if sometimes aggravating laws that Askew ultimately pushed, if you can say you have a favorite statute in Florida statutes, is the Florida Sunshine Laws, which is very aggravating to work with if you've ever worked with it, because you have to record everything. But what it did was really bring a kind of moral clarity to how you do government through transparency. So this was difficult to argue against. What the legislation infuriated existing leaders and elites because they had seen government as a handshake and an agreement behind closed doors. But that created and reinforced existing power structures that were really resistant to change. And Askew, as kind of the poor boy from Pensacola, recognized that that was not the only way to do democracy. So when he was asked, Askew said, "You've got to remember, in government, whose business you're doing, the people's. And if you're doing the people's business, you've got to give them the tools to judge the product. The information has to be out there." Askew was the rare reformer who held ideals but resisted the excesses of idealism. You can't legislate morality, he explained, but you can create an atmosphere that very much leads to openness and let the public decide what's moral and what's not. So Askew's legacy is very fitting for the Department of Government, for the college, for UWF, Pensacola, and for Florida, but it is also fitting for this evening's talk. Reuben Askew exemplified the best instincts of democracy with the clever discipline of republicanism. So this evening, our speaker, Dr. Mobrand, will be discussing the shape of modern democracy in Asia and here in the United States and around the world. Democracy is, in turns, fascinating, challenging, and promising, and Dr. Mobrand's work really illustrates this. I think, and I believe Governor Askew would appreciate not only our topic this evening, but the spirit of public engagement and intellectual transparency that inspires it. So I wanted to give you a little bit of background on Askew, who, ever since we changed the name of the department, really has fascinated me as an individual and a figure. I hope you appreciate him a little more, and with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Kim.
Thank you, Dr. Shavli, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Elvis Kim, Assistant Professor of Comparative Politics and this year's Askew Fellow. On behalf of our department, thank you all for joining us for this special lecture. on East Asia, United States, and the future of democracy. We are also pleased to recognize our Askew student scholar, Rebecca Paczkowski, who've done outstanding work on the relationship between religion and democratization in Turkey. Tonight's lecture honors the legacy of Governor Rubin Askew, that Dr. Shavli already explained, a leader remembered for his commitment to civic engagement and his willingness to confront pressing public policy issues. His legacy reminds us democracy is not just a static achievement, but also an ongoing practice, one that requires vigilance, participation, and at times reform. That reminder feels especially timely now. Scholars today often describe our moment as part of third wave of authoritization or democratic backsliding. But what's striking about this period is that democratic decline rarely looks like the dramatic breakdowns we might imagine. Democracy today often do not collapse overnight, they are gradually undermined. In many cases, elections still take place, courts still function, and constitutions remain in place. But the rules of the political game began to change: who is allowed to participate, what kinds of oppositions are considered legitimate, or what kind of issues can be publicly debated. In other words, democracy may persist in form, while its substance is slowly transformed. And sometimes the most telling sign of this is not a louder protest, but quieter withdrawal, declining participation, self-censorship, and the sense that certain questions can no longer be openly asked. But at the same time, the global picture is far from uniform. Democratic resilience and innovation continue to emerge in many places, often in unexpected ways. This makes it all the more important to think comparatively and globally about democracy, not as a single model, but as practice influenced by history, institutions, and social forces. Ultimately, democracy depends not only on what is written in constitutions and informal rules, but also depends on whether people continue to believe in and give meanings to those rules in practice. It's precisely this kind of perspective that our guest speaker is bringing to us today. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Erik Mobrand, who has traveled all the way from South Korea to be with us today. And we are especially grateful for the efforts and time he has taken to join us. Dr. Mobrand is a professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University in South Korea. He has previously taught at National University of Singapore and served as the Korea Policy Chair at the RAND Corporation. His research spans South Korean politics, democratization, urban politics and resistance, authoritarian legality, and international science collaboration. He's also the author of Top-Down Democracy in South Korea, a widely regarded contribution to the field. On a personal note, it's especially meaningful for me to introduce Dr. Mobrand. He was my advisor during my MA studies at Seoul National. I remain deeply grateful for his mentorship, guidance, and example as a scholar. In today's talk, Dr. Mobrand will invite us to think more broadly and comparatively about democracy at a time of challenge and change. Drawing on his expertise in East Asia and beyond, he will explore different forces influencing democracy around the world in different contexts and help us better understand what is at stake in the current moment. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Erik Mobrand.
Thank you, Dr. Kim, for that generous introduction, and to Dr. Shively as well. It is a great honor to be here, and I really appreciate the hospitality and this incredible venue, and it's wonderful to see this audience here today. It is also an honor to be speaking at an event named after Governor Askew, who I understand is a remarkable exemplar of a public servant. And I will attempt in my comments to remain in keeping with his spirit of trying to improve politics and improve democracy. Democracy is difficult to study for a number of reasons. One is that it is very close to our ideals. We believe it is important. It can be part of our civic and collective identities. Yet it is also of this world. It is something that exists objectively in the world around us and in this almost spiritual world of what we deem to be important. How can we study something if it is almost magical, if it has this ideal aspect to us? I find this makes it very difficult to study democracy. When we're having a conversation about democracy, are we discussing the practices or are we discussing the ideals? It becomes unclear in a lot of conversations, whether academic or non-academic, about democracy. An American political scientist once said that studying politics is not like an entomologist studying an anthill, it's like ants studying an anthill. Because we're inside the thing. We're inside the thing and we cannot see everything around us. And that is part of the challenge of studying democracy. We are inside it. We give meaning to it and try to study it as something external to us. And this makes it very, very difficult. In my talk today, I want to focus on these subjective aspects of democracy, on the meanings that we give the term. And in particular, I want to focus on meanings in other parts of the world, in parts of the world where I have had the chance to spend some time. And I want to share those perspectives with you here. A big part of the reason for doing this is that I think these perspectives get relatively little attention in much discussion in this country or perhaps in English language writing in general. I also am presenting ideas and reflections that are new. I have not written about them. I feel I owe it to you. You've come all this way. I'm not going to present something that I've already written about or that others have written about. This is not some speculation or a rehashing of others' ideas. Rather, I want to share the reflections I have based on what I have observed and analyzed around me, whether I'm right or wrong. I think it's important if we're going to understand politics in East Asia, for example, to understand the meanings that are attached to democracy and to various parts of political participation. This is also important. Having a sense of these subjective understandings is also important for understanding how East Asia responds to the United States. The United States has tremendous influence in that region. And if we want to understand the implications and reach of that influence, it helps if we understand how people there understand what they themselves are doing. So this will help us to understand something about American foreign policy, I hope. Now, I am someone, I'm not Korean. It's no secret here. I do not identify as Korean. So I would seem maybe not to have the best qualifications for doing this, and maybe I haven't. But here's what I've got. I listen. I grew up in a small town in the United States, but I have been fortunate to have opportunities to travel, and I've ended up spending most of my career overseas in East and Southeast Asia, and I try to listen to what I hear going on around me. These are really my main tools. I trespass and I eavesdrop, not literally and not illegally, but I go where I'm not really invited necessarily, and I listen in on conversations that are meant to be among people from the same country, and then I try to understand what they're saying and try to interpret it. So trespassing, eavesdropping, and interpretation are the main methods that I bring to this study. Many of the themes that I'm going to talk about have already been anticipated by Dr. Shively and Dr. Kim, so I'm hoping I have something to add here. I think there are a couple of frames or ways of talking about trends in relation to democracy around the world today, and these are framings or vocabularies or imaginaries that we see in commentaries in the newspaper, for example. One of them has to do with autocratization. and this has been mentioned by Dr. Kim. We can find political scientists in various parts of the world running surveys. How democratic is the world today? Looking at country after country and coming up with ways of assessing the level of democracy along different dimensions over time. What these studies seem to show is that there is this democratic backsliding in recent years. We are unfortunately perhaps in a period of autocratization. And this is, of course, unfortunate from the perspective of democracy. On the other hand, in East Asia, it's maybe a more complex picture. In a place like South Korea, we have had some tremendous challenges in recent years, and I'll be speaking rather at length on one of those. But there are also some amazing positive achievements in relation to democracy, and arguably some deepening of democracy that does not fit with a global story of democratic backslide. I'm trying to lead us towards some optimism eventually, right? We don't want to end gloomy today. I think a perspective, we need these perspectives that look at democratization or democratic deepening versus autocratization. We need these ideas, but they also give us a rather simple picture, because there could be other dimensions of politics that we're not yet so aware of. I think imagination was a word that was mentioned earlier as well. Perhaps there are ways of engaging in democratic politics that we simply are unaware of, that may be practiced in other places or maybe awaiting us in the future. And a frame such as democratization versus autocratization does not fully capture all of that. So this is one sort of framing of our current moment globally. Another approach or vocabulary that we see in op-eds and a lot that's coming out from Washington, D.C. has to do with the end of the international liberal order, the liberal international order. That's kind of a mouthful of a term. It's the kind of term that academics like, the liberal international order. What is that? I think it has something to do with a period of rather open trade, where there are attempts to keep trade barriers as low as is reasonably possible, while allowing national governments around the world to have some amount of regulation in the areas that they find important, some ways to support their own economies and businesses. We can think about it in relation to globalization, right? That this liberal order facilitated the era of globalization that really took off from the 1980s or 1990s. And we can also associate this liberal order with the expansion of democracy. Wave of autocratization was mentioned earlier. Well, this was preceded by a wave of democratization from around the late 1970s. And so if we look globally, we see that from the late 1970s, for the next few decades, the world becomes more and more democratic. That means we get more countries becoming democratic, those that were democratic deepening their democracy. And these things go together. Well, trade is not exactly what it was some years back. There is much more regulation of trade. This period of free trade is either on the wane or very challenged or behind us. And if there is this autocratization at the same time, have these things gone together? And what we're observing with challenges to democracy today are part of this fading of the liberal international order. Could be. I think this sort of story suggests a narrative of progress, that there was an expectation that history naturally follows this progress toward a world where countries are trading more and more openly and becoming more and more democratic. That may be well and good, but it's also a profoundly ahistorical perspective to take. It's not telling us what is moving this engine forward, what is driving all of the good stuff that's coming, and what might slow it down. And so this gives reason to be a little bit perhaps skeptical of this story, that we have entered perhaps the end of the international liberal order, and democracy is being challenged at the same time. East Asia is, it turns out, central to a story about the liberal international order. Why would that be? The globalization as we have known it is very much tied into the East Asian experience. From the 1960s, we have mass production in places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan. A lot of the goods that they're producing at low cost are coming to us here in America, producing good enough quality at the right price for American consumers. Oftentimes, these countries had preferential deals on their trade because of their relationships with the United States in security terms. In the 1970s, we have the opening of China, something that the United States had wanted much earlier. This finally came slowly in the 1970s. And this set the basis for a deepening and substantial widening of our system. As China grew as an important supplier of labor for the goods that we produce, places like Korea and Taiwan became important middlemen. We have innovative firms emerging in Korea and Taiwan, designing goods, then going to China to source labor and exporting those goods to places like the United States and elsewhere. We had a lot of prosperity all around because of this system. Now, one can argue that there are a couple of reasons to suspect that the China-US rivalry that we now find ourselves in was perhaps already looming, that it was not the result of more recent approaches alone, but that there is a historic basis to this. And kind of round one of that comes actually not with China, but with Japan. In the early 1980s, there was a lot of concern in this country about Japan's rise as an industrial power and what that meant for the United States and for the international system. With China, we're back again in that sort of situation, but on a vastly larger scale. One of the factors that could possibly give us a sense that this period of globalization was perhaps time limited is American deindustrialization, that we had so much globalization that a lot of the manufacturing went overseas. Europe had done less of this deindustrialization, especially in high-end areas. Europe has its own challenges today that are perhaps more severe than we face here in the United States, but they've taken a bit of a different approach to this problem. Instead, here in the United States, we focused more on financial capital and conceded a substantial part of our industrial base. Now we've seen in the last several years a kind of rediscovery of industrial policy. The Koreans, by the way, are very surprised to see this because industrial policy had been their thing for a long time, figuring out how to find those niche areas, develop the best products, and promote them overseas. And now the Americans have rediscovered industrial policy. This kind of leads naturally to some competition with China as such a crucial industrial country today. It also leads, I think, by accident, to some competition between the United States and its allies in East Asia. And I'll say more on that in a little bit. Another factor that contributed to a potential looming of this US-China rivalry is the continued defensive posture of the United States in the Pacific, that military presence remained in the region even as the Cold War drew to a close. And again, my purpose here is to share perspectives, subjective self-understandings from the region, and I just want to invite us to think about how would this look from the perspective of people in China living in a country that is growing increasingly prosperous at a great rate and aspiring to contribute to kind of governance of the world in some way. And there's, of course, a lot of people in China and many different ideas about what that kind of contribution could look like. Some ideas matter more than others, but there would be many different ideas. Surely, it's understandable that people in China would feel maybe even rather surrounded by this continuing military presence, even though the international security landscape has changed. Again, my purpose here is not to judge whether that's right or wrong or whether there was a strategic mistake, but just to present that kind of subjective understanding and to think about its implications. All of this is to say that perhaps we have not had this sudden shift away from a normal condition of progress toward greater and greater connectedness through trade and more democracy, that perhaps there are historic forces at work. All right, but I'd like to suggest a somewhat different way of thinking about these issues. And I would like us to contextualize democracy. The title of the talk has future of democracy in it, so if something like democracy has a future, then surely it has a past as well. And if it's got a past, that means it has a history. And things that exist in history, they change over time. Sometimes scholars will think of democracy as this one fixed thing. And sometimes we need to do that in order to understand change over time. But like anything else historical, it is certainly going to change over time and from place to place. And I think we can do a lot if we imagine democracy in these terms, if we put it into temporal and spatial context. I think such an approach is important not just for understanding the present and the past, but for thinking about challenges of the future. And we've got a few of them. We have technological change. How are dramatic technological changes going to alter the ways that we practice democracy? Rapidly expanding wealth inequality. How are we going to adapt to that? Climate change. These are all big problems, or issues rather, of the future. And surely democracy is going to change. The way we practice politics is going to change in the face of these sorts of issues. So I think it is helpful to have a sense of democracy as this malleable thing, as something that adjusts over time and across space, for these very practical reasons of planning for the future. All right, and all of this now takes me more squarely to East Asia. And East Asia is home to some of the most successful democracies of the past few decades, and that's great news. And some of the most successful non-Western democracies, full stop. We have Japan with several decades of continuous democratic history. We have Taiwan, despite its status as a state, but not exactly a state because it's not recognized internationally, having nonetheless a democracy, a thriving civil society, a competitive political party landscape. That's a pretty amazing development. And then in South Korea, you'll see that I'm quite partial to South Korea here. In South Korea too, we have a successful democracy, not without challenges, but with a successful democracy. And I'd like to talk at some length here about South Korea's democracy, and I do this not just to promote Korea's democracy, but rather to get to, I think, some lessons, because I believe we have had responses to challenges in Korea that are quite intriguing and that outside of Korea give us some food for thought. But it's going to take me a moment to get there, all right? So, in Korea, we are, in East Asia on this peninsula that is hanging out there between Big China and the islands of Japan. It's a place that has a long history of continuous cultural identity. That is, people speaking a distinct language, understanding themselves and each other as Koreans and as distinct from those around them. It's also a place that experienced 36 years of brutal colonial rule from Japan in the first half of the 20th century, an experience that shaped the country greatly. That was followed by division of the peninsula. And again, this is a moment where it's important to think about this subjective perspective. What does the division of the Korean peninsula look like from the perspective of South Korean people? as I mentioned, there is a long history of this collective identity as Koreans, and there was no sense of certainly of South and North Koreans. There was a sense that we are one nation. And having the experience of colonial subjugation only hardened that idea of a single Korean nationhood. And there we were, 1945. Thankfully, the war has ended. The Japanese are pulling out. And in East Asia, what happens? Well, in Europe, the aggressor Germany got divided. In East Asia, what happened? Wait a minute here. This doesn't seem quite right. Korea, a victim of colonialism, a victim of colonial rule by an aggressor in the war, ended up divided. This is a rather odd development, isn't it? Now, there are, of course, understandable historical and geopolitical reasons why this division emerged as it did. But from the subjective perspective of Koreans, it certainly seems very odd and rather unjust. Why on earth would we, as victims of the war aggressor, end up divided? The feeling from that, I think, is very important for understanding a lot about Korea. There's a lot of pride about Korean cultural identity, and there is a strong sense that the country has not been able to exercise the autonomy that it deserves. I think we see this in North Korea. North Korea's rhetoric also reflects this kind of sensibility as well. But it's quite frustrating for a proud nation to have been subjected colonially. It was liberated, not really by its own doing, it was liberated from the outside, but then it could not control its own affairs and ended up being divided. All of this is really tough for a proud nation. So we had division of the Korean peninsula decided from the outside by 1945. By 1950, we entered war, and we have 3 years of Korean War, a war that killed many people and resolved nothing. The border stayed more or less where it was, and it brought this death and destruction and only a hardening of the boundary on the peninsula. In South Korea, the war, we're going to get to some happy things later, okay? Because you have to bear with me through this period, okay? It's important to understand the tragedy and the frustration in order to understand the positive and hopeful bits, I promise. After the war, we end up with a series of autocrats, right? It's only getting worse for the Korean people. There is a brief experiment with something like democracy. There are open-ish elections, but that regime comes crumbling down by the end of the 1950s. We end up with the military as the most modern organization in the country taking power, and then we get an extended period up until the late 1980s of harsh dictatorship under military generals. It's a place where atrocities occurred, people disappeared off the streets, terrible things happened. Korean people also had a very strong sense of injustice, once again, just as they had under colonial rule and with the division of the peninsula. And they tried, in the kind of cracks and crevices where articulate people could move, to express that sense of injustice. And we eventually get an underground mobilization against the regime. This takes form in the late 1970s. People are in situations that they really cannot bear anymore. Others are trying to mobilize different people in society to fight against the dictatorship. And this underground movement spreads, and we have large protests into the 1980s. Eventually, in 1987, the protests achieve such scale, they involve not radical elements, but ordinary middle-class people and students who are fed up. And in 1987, the regime concedes constitutional reforms. And so we get a rather sudden political liberalization of the country, and new direct presidential elections are brought back in. And over time, it rather quickly becomes something like a normal democracy, albeit with its own conditions, a place that has experienced recent harsh dictatorship and is trying to deal with that trauma, and also one that is in the context of a divided nation. This is one part of a divided nation. That is the self-understanding of people in South Korea. I'll also say that I'm regularly struck in South Korea by the high level of civic engagement. It is a place where ordinary people are exceptionally plugged in to politics. This Korean popular culture gets a lot of attention internationally these days, and of course domestically as well. But if you were to take the subway, and this is where I'm eavesdropping and trespassing a little bit, and look over the shoulders of people and what they're watching on their mobile phones, some are watching the entertainment, many are following political programs. They're listening to their favorite YouTube stations or other podcasters who are commenting on, in a really engaging way, politics. And we have this kind of crew of journalists turned entertainers who everybody listens to. And this means we get a very high level of political literacy in the country. So I regularly find this really remarkable in Korea. I want to zoom forward and talk about a recent constitutional crisis that we had in the country, because the response to the crisis and the aftermath of the crisis is, I think, enlightening. As you may have heard, in December 2024, the then president suddenly declared martial law and said that there were enemies of the state around and he needed to seize special power. And this would, of course, mean that the National Assembly would be dismissed, and all of these ordinary channels for political representation and discussion would be at least temporarily gone. By the Constitution, the president does have a right to declare martial law under certain conditions and following certain procedures. This was an alarming moment for many people in South Korea or watching South Korea. Now it is widely understood this was really an attempted self-coup. There was clearly no legal justification for announcing martial law because there was no imminent threat. There was no news or no intelligence about a significant threat from North Korea or anybody else. Not only that, but the president had not gone through the proper procedures in order to declare martial law. Instead of permitting or encouraging the National Assembly to support the national law, he had sent in special forces to block entrance to the National Assembly so that legislators could not go there and vote on it. Well, legislators did go, and there were dramatic scenes of legislators climbing over rather poorly built blockades to get into the National Assembly and to express themselves. They responded remarkably quickly, within minutes really, and this was during the night. Within minutes, the National Assemblymen had gone to, as many as they could, gone to the National Assembly, the leader of the opposition party had live streamed himself going there and showing that he is taking action. This is not the sort of transparency that Governor Askew had at his fingertips, but it is another sort of transparency. The response, in the end, was impressive. Institutions worked. The legislature made clear that this was not going to happen, stopped it. Within hours, the president had to back down. One still had to deal with the matter because now you had a president who had illegally declared martial law, and that would make it very difficult for him to continue in the role as president without addressing whether that was right or not. This led to a process over several weeks and then months by which he was impeached, and then the Constitutional Court fully removed him from office. Then legal proceedings went ahead to see how long he would spend in prison, which is where he is now. So it ended in that way, in a way that seems quite nice, but I want to go back to some of the moments during this constitutional crisis. A first point is, was democracy going to break down in South Korea? If this was an attempted self-coup, then it seems quite possible that democracy would break down. From a political science perspective, this is very remarkable. We learn in political science that wealthy democracies, they don't fall apart. You may have some autocratic countries get wealthy and remain autocratic, but once such a country becomes democratic, it tends to stay democratic. This is something that political scientists have observed. And so I think some of the initial reaction to the event in the small political science community that I follow was not to be so concerned. It doesn't happen. Wealthy democracies don't break down. But being in Seoul at the time, that was not so reassuring, I have to say. What I found rather remarkable was the strong sense that the actions and decisions that people at the time were taking would have great impact. And in some ways, especially in hindsight, that is a real sense of empowerment that I had actually never experienced before. It was this kind of a tipping moment where it felt that depending on what people did, it could go one way or another. And those two options were dramatically different. So this is more of my subjective experience of the event. Correlations, political scientists like to make correlations between things, and those are important, but when you're in the moment of one episode, one doesn't feel that one can really rely on a large-scale correlation. Another point that I'd like to make about this episode is something that happened in the few days after the attempted declaration of martial law. Once martial law was declared, there was this universal condemnation of it. But a few days later, the media and some political actors started speaking a little bit more cautiously. And they were not being so condemnatory of this event. I think this moment is also an important moment to reflect on. And it ended up extending for a number of weeks. Once the president was finally impeached by the legislature, then he needed to be detained. And he resisted being detained, and there were vigilantes who also protected him and prevented him from being detained. So we had this several weeks standoff there in central Seoul. I think during this pause, there was a real consideration among powerful people in Korea about whether to keep democracy or not. And that is a rather amazing thing. That makes it absolutely the most serious crisis in the country's almost 40 years of democracy. That we had powerful figures in the legislature, allies of the then president in the legislature, and other forces in society becoming, I think, quite skeptical. Maybe it's better if we throw in our hat with the president and go with this attempted self-coup. Again, this was a very powerful moment and makes you think about how what happens in that moment matters a great deal. And then this brings me to the ordinary people and the response from the ordinary people, which was immediate. I think people took about 5 to 10 minutes to check on their phones whether there was any security threat, determined that there was not, and then they knew what to do. They knew exactly what to do. The more enthusiastic ones, even though it was late at night, went out to the area where the National Assembly was and expressed their sentiments, expressed their outrage that this was wrong. Others got a little bit of sleep that night and came out the next day or in subsequent days, or came out during the first vote by the National Assembly to impeach the president. But how could they come out so quickly? How did they know what to do? This I find really interesting. Some of the immediate international news coverage pointed out rather flippantly that South Korea has had 9 or 10 episodes of martial law in its history. Here we go again. Those Koreans, they really like to suspend normal procedure and put the military up front. This is dead wrong. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It's precisely because of such a history, because they had experienced horrible periods of martial law, in particular certain episodes where martial law was used to kill, the military killed its own citizens. This completely delegitimated martial law in the eyes of ordinary Koreans. That declaring martial law in the name of national security, we've seen this before. We know this is not a real threat, not a credible threat, and we know what it means. This is yet another one of those exercises in unjust use of power by those in office. So it's because of this history and because of the memory of this history that people knew what to do. I find this memory of past tragic history fascinating and again also empowering in South Korea's case. The movements that led to Korea's democracy were really buttressed by the outrage that came with experiences of crackdown by the regime. And so the democracy, the country's democracy, is very much associated with this sort of resistance, with speaking out against the unjust use of power. And people maintain memories of that mobilization, of the sense of empowerment that comes with that mobilization. Indeed, I think a lot of the civic national identity is tied to speaking out collectively against the unjust use of power. This had been maintained, this sort of memory had been maintained and recreated through a few different mechanisms. One is through a series of demonstrations. Over the past 25 years or so, there have been periodic peaceful demonstrations when something has happened that people felt outraged about. And they developed techniques of mobilization. They call these candlelight movements because people from the beginning would bring out candles. Now they put candle images on their mobile phone and hold them up. Yeah? So there's a common trope, but there's also adjustment over time in these demonstrations. So when there are these moments of injustice, people know, oh, it's time to break out those candle pictures, do the other things that we associate with demonstrating peacefully. And they have amazing peaceful rallies. 10 years ago in 2016, 2017, there was another constitutional crisis. And we had the largest demonstrations in Korean history. People coming together, nobody knew each other. These were nearly spontaneous rallies, and yet we had no violence. No pillaging, no looting, none of it. It was amazing. This is something I think that deserves further study. How does one get such coordination? The best I can offer is this common understanding of what we must do in this moment. There are other things that perpetuate these memories as well, films, and I encourage anyone to watch any of the Korean films about recent political history, because these also tell stories about the kind of injustice that was done in the recent past and how bad it was. And this, I think, reinforces self-understandings about who we are as Koreans and how we participate in democracy. The day after the martial law declaration, I was on my campus there in Seoul, and it's not a terribly politically engaged campus, but there was a poster up the next morning talking about the series of uprisings that had occurred against dictatorship in South Korea's history. And then the writer of the poster was saying that we owe our everyday life of going to the library, of eating in the cafeteria on campus. We owe this to those who came before us. Now it is our turn. This was just what someone had put up overnight on campus. And I think that this is a sentiment that could be widely understood across the country. So there was this sense of common identity and of what to do when one faces an unjust exercise of power. And this mobilizes people to come onto the streets. And I'd like us to think of this as an actual constitutional check on power. When we think about public law and about constitutional politics, we usually think about what is written down. In our country here, that is how we think about checks and balances and about constitutions. And the Constitution in this country has this magical force. It's part of the story of what makes the democracy special and what creates the nation and the people. But not every country has the same relationship with its written constitution. Written constitutions relate to actual public law and actual democratic checks and balances on power in different ways. South Korea has a constitution that came largely from the outside. It was given a document. It was not a document in which people had invested meaning at that moment. Over time, they have certainly invested meaning in it, especially in certain portions of it. But the the constitution in South Korea is not something that gets people excited. It's not something that can tug at heartstrings or pull people together. It's other things. It's these memories of injustice and the sense of what ordinary people can do. So I had many discussions in the aftermath of the martial law episode about what should be done next. How can we institutionalize politics better in Korea? That discussion needs to happen. I don't really have much to say as an outsider on that. But I think it is worth considering that ordinary people, their memories, their self-understandings, can act as a constitutional force. In the case of Korea, they have done so on a couple of occasions, including in this greatest of the crises of democracy in the country, and they have worked remarkably well. They have checked elite power by calling out wrongdoing, and by doing that, they are able to buttress the formal political institutions, the National Assembly, the courts, all of these other actors which did pull their own weight. People were there shouting about what was wrong, and that makes a huge difference. And I think this is a really interesting example because it's not how we usually think about checks and balances. It's different from the more formal ways of thinking about the spread of power in a democracy. All right. I want to say a few things about the future of the United States in the East Asian region, if I have five more minutes or so. We have solid alliances between places like the United States and South Korea and Japan, but we have also fallen into rivalry with China. These are rivalries over many issues, security issues, economic issues, over technology. Again, as technologies change, do we have to build our own sovereign technological capacities? To what extent can we trade and rely on each other to gain access to leading technologies? It seems to be different to the past. I hope this rivalry need not be bitter. We'll see about that. Hopefully there is some space still for cooperation. China, in its neighborhood and to the developing world, has some attractive language. When China goes to other parts of Asia, to South Asia, to Southeast Asia, or West, they talk about prosperity, about development. They use terms that can really resonate with governments and people in developing countries. And this is part of what has allowed China to have a great deal of influence in some parts of the world, and in some places, a lot more direct influence in some neighboring countries. I think this is an area where the United States has space for creativity, for thinking about how the United States can build bridges with other parts of the world. My own view is that offering democracy is in itself, on the surface, not the strongest claim. Even if one of the aims is eventually to strengthen democracy around the world, talking about democracy, making that the talking point in dealing with these parts of the world, is perhaps not the best way to sell the United States. American allies in the region and other friends feel increasingly squeezed between the United States and China in ways that they haven't been in the past. And South Korea is one of these. Again, South Korea has played its role perfectly as a middleman between Chinese labor and American and other markets, doing the innovation for things that get built in Chinese and other factories. They've played that part well. And then, as I noted before, with the American rediscovery of industrial policy, Korea feels a bit hard done by. There's a sense that we kind of had a deal. It's not that we separate security matters and trade and investment matters. We kind of had a deal. And that seems to be a little bit undone without having a discussion. Again, I'm just saying what I think a common view in Korea is, not assessing whether this is a right or wrong view. So there's a little bit of a sense of being snubbed. Again, the alliance between the United States and Korea is solid. There is no serious political actor in South Korea that questions the alliance with the United States. And yet, the economy has become so integrated with China in ways that have largely benefited the United States until recently. So what do we do with this? This puts South Korea in a very, very difficult position. And in fact, a lot of Southeast Asia is also in this position, feeling increasingly squeezed between China and the United States. I think I should wrap up here. I've gone over time. There's two reasons, I think, why we should try to understand perspectives from places such as East Asia. One is that I think it can help us to think more flexibly about politics, about policy, and about democracy. What are the options out there? I think it's a great practice to try and look at what other countries are doing, whether for right or wrong, whether with good consequences or bad. I think we have tremendous learning opportunities by looking at what's happening in other countries, especially a country like South Korea that is a democracy and innovative and all of that. It can help us expand our imagination for what is possible in the realm of the political. And imagination is something that I think we need a lot of in the near future. And secondly, and finally, it's useful to understand these perspectives from the outside when we are engaging our partners overseas. It can help us to read the landscape, and this can help us to build better cooperation and to serve both American and collective interests in the region. And I'll end my comments at this point, and I look forward to questions and discussion about any of this. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Is that okay?
Oh,
okay, so you mentioned that Korea was under a series of military dictatorships and martial law. What is the modern relationship between the military, the government, and the voting population, especially in the wake of the 2024 declaration of martial law?
Thanks, and I'll respond right away. In the 1990s, as South Korea's democracy deepened, we had a pretty abrupt separation of civil and military authorities that was quite successful. In the recent episode, I think we also saw that the military acted remarkably well. This is my understanding of what we know up until now. There were only a few people beside the president who were involved in the self-coup attempt. There had been very high-risk things. I think the United States should have been furious about all of this. There had been drones flown at the president's order into North Korea to try to provoke conflict. This would entrap the United States in a conflict that it does not need or want. This was horrible. What we saw on the night of the self-coup attempt was military personnel in a very difficult situation. Imagine being somebody senior. I mean, the security situation is tough enough on the Korean Peninsula. It's a high-stress job, and then being ordered by the president to do something illegal. These people were under immense pressure. The understanding now is that they acted very, very well. Just to give one example, when there was an attempt to keep people out of the legislature, well, you'd think that the military would know how to build a barricade that would keep some, not necessarily the youngest people out. Clearly, they did not put their best effort forward. They went through the motions, right? Which is quite admirable. They found ways to comply or feign compliance and not do something terribly illegal. And what happened later is we had interviews came out on television with some of the personnel, and we had guys, these military guys coming out crying about the pressure they faced, and many of them are dealing with psychological issues because of the horror of what had happened. But for now, based on what we understand, the understanding is that there is a very clear separation between the military and politics.
Do you feel that free trade will recover, and is it important to world democracy and our income?
So will free trade recover, and is that essential to democracy? Yeah, it's a big question. I think that there is a real struggle to come up with a big vision in places like South Korea, much of East and Southeast Asia. Again, they're feeling really, really tight. We can think about Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines. All of these countries feel very, very squeezed, and it's hard to articulate a big vision about how do we map out a path forward. And I think this is something that is really worrying. I am trying to be optimistic here about democracy, because I think there are ways that people innovate and use their imagination to come up with other solutions. So I would think that there are ways to keep democracy, even as we see a greater emphasis on some self-reliance, and hopefully not all the way to autarky, but yes. Shall I? Yeah.
I understand that there was a past incidents with martial law, but why specifically in this case did the military relent to the National Assembly instead of remaining loyal to the president?
Yeah, we don't know the inside story, but I think that senior leadership in the military understood that this was not appropriate, because they know the conditions under which martial law can be declared and the process that should be followed, and that process was not being followed. And so there would have been somebody or somebodies who had made the call to do this. And the conditions, the last time we had martial law was in 1980. And this was part of basically a protracted coup that was successful, and that led to encirclement of the town of Gwangju in the southwest of Korea. And that is kind of the touchstone for South Korea's democracy. If there's any magical moment, it is like the Constitution in the United States, it is Gwangju in Korea, because that is where you have special forces coming in and killing civilians. Everybody knew this was completely wrong and can never happen again, and that is what gives the force to this. And just to add one thing, when the president was resisting arrest in those several weeks after he was impeached, there were people, a lot of rather senior people, lined outside of his residence, blocking the way. Now you would think that police or whoever needs to could work their way in and take him out, but they did not. I think they didn't because they wanted to be as peaceful as possible. They knew that if they did something, even if it was not their fault directly, that led to violence or somebody being hurt, this would undermine their legitimacy. And so they were extremely cautious to prevent any episode of violence from occurring. It's not a purely legal sensibility there, but I think it was important to them to maintain that legitimacy by not allowing any violence to occur.
My question is, how much do you think the mandatory military service influences political literacy in the Korean population?
Why would it influence it? Do you have any theory?
As a veteran,
Yeah.
I was never more aware of our political ideology than when I was serving, because it directly influenced my day-to-day.
Yeah.
So, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really intriguing question. My immediate hunch would be that it would be less in the case of South Korea than what you might have experienced here. I think there are other spaces in which people get drawn into discussions of politics in other parts of life, and less through military service. That's my hunch, but it's something that deserves further attention, I think. Yeah. Thanks.
What do you believe it would take for all of East Asia, more specifically China and North Korea, to be able to become democratic? Like, what do you think it would take to kind of make that happen?
Yeah. Those are the tough ones too, right? You didn't start with the easy ones. About 15 years ago, much of the community of China watchers expected that China was heading in a democratic direction. We've talked about innovation, and there were innovations, really interesting innovations in the Chinese leadership about dispersal of power. In a relatively short time, we had gone from rule by single individual to rule by a larger collective. The Politburo Standing Committee, as a group of 7 or 9, was making decisions. There have been changes in the emergence of factions and how do the different factions work with each other. In fact, they had to negotiate and cooperate. There were some predictions from top experts that this would eventually lead to a more formal split in the party and we'd get to democracy that way. It didn't happen. It might have happened. It did not happen. Other things happened. We ended up getting a greater personalization of power, a more effective dictatorship, and so it's taken another turn. So it looks very tough for democracy in any time in the short term in China. There's a great deal of reliance on more repressive institutions rather than on institutions that listen to people's voices, and our common sense would tell us that in a complex society that is very difficult to maintain. People in any complex society encounter problems, and it's useful to governments to have ways for people to express those so that there can be feedback mechanisms. But now is a moment where it is hard to see how exactly that will happen. So I think it's a tough situation.
Sir, you wrote a book called, excuse me, I'll try to keep the volume constant. You wrote a book called Top-Down Democracy. Can you please give a brief synopsis of that concept? And do you think it's tied to the Asian culture of senior worship, if you will, or respect for your elders?
Thanks. I think I've talked today about how conditions can shape democracy. And I think that democracy has multiple potentials within it. That it can be something that is quite liberating to people It can elicit a lot of participation from ordinary people. It can make people feel represented, feel included. But democracy can also do the opposite, that there can be leaders who find ways to keep things secret. We heard about Governor Askew and the importance of reporting what public officials have for the sake of democracy. There is that side to things. I called it top-down democracy because I describe ways that political party elites in South Korea have imperfectly been able to reduce some participation from ordinary citizens. Not at all moments and not at all times, but this has been a major trend for a big part of South Korea's early democratic history. And I do not think it is cultural. And I do not think it is tied to being a new democracy either. I think it is really about a potential that exists in any democracy. In writing the book, I'm also inspired by earlier European social theorists in the late 19th century. In the early 20th century, there was a lot of concern about these things, that democracy can breed despotism, and we need to have ways to patrol that. I think the cultural stuff, actually it does come out in Korea. And so if you look at political parties in the past, less so today, but 10, 15 years ago, there would be the pulling of rank. So the senior leaders in a party would say, you know, I have gone through these hardships, I'm older than you, I have authority over you. My own read on this is that this is justifying the power that they already had through other instruments.
You really touch on the reaction that Washington had for the coup, the failed coup in 2024.
Yeah.
But I want to know, what do you think Pyongyang and Beijing's assessment of the situation was? Do you think it was a potential weakness in the South Korean democracy, or was it a show of strength of American influence and democracy as a whole?
Oh, yeah, this is a really important question for policy reasons, isn't it? There was some sense in the aftermath that, boy, we were kind of lucky here in South Korea that that Pyongyang did not take advantage of this moment and do something. So there was a sense of relief that did not happen. Maybe this moment opened up that opportunity, and you had really bizarre discussions. I will tell you a bizarre discussion that happened in Korea. Why might Pyongyang not have done anything? They were busy elsewhere. They were busy helping Russia and Ukraine. This was actually a point that was voiced in serious political analysis as one hypothesis, which is kind of mind-blowing to say and think that South Korea was helped by that engagement. But that is one of the views that came out. I think as time went on, we became more concerned with the earlier efforts by the then president to try to provoke North Korea into war. I think that is, clearly very serious.
Let's Dr. Mobrand and for his insightful lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you.